The morning that everything changed started the way most dangerous mornings do, quietly, with good weather. Fresh flowers and everyone smiling at everyone else and nobody meaning a single word of it. It was one of those rare British summer days where the sky actually cooperated, pale blue and clean, the kind of sky that makes you feel like everything is going to be fine. Buckingham, I guess, Palace Gardens were dressed for the occasion. Thousands of people had gathered on the manicured lawns, foreign dignitaries, charity patrons, members of the press kept at a respectable distance, staff who had spent 3 days preparing for this exact afternoon. A formal garden party. The kind the royal family had done hundreds of times before. The kind where everyone knows their role, everyone knows their place, and everything is choreographed down to the angle of the flower arrangements. Princess Charlotte arrived with the quiet confidence of a child who has grown up knowing that cameras are always watching. She was young, but already she understood the performance. She stood straight. She smiled at the right people. She greeted elderly guests with a warmth that looked genuine because, in Charlotte's case, it mostly was. People who had met her often said the same thing, that she had her mother's ability to make you feel like the only person in the room. She was, by every account that afternoon, perfectly composed. She wore pale lavender. Basically, her hair was neat. She walked beside her family with the practiced ease of someone 3 times her age. The afternoon moved the way these events are supposed to move. Slowly. Gracefully. Plus, with long pauses for polite conversation and short bursts of soft laughter. The kind of laughter where nobody is actually that amused but everyone is being very civilized about it. Camilla was already holding court near the center of the garden, which was her preferred position at any gathering, central enough to be visible, surrounded by enough people to be insulated. She had the easy authority of someone who had spent decades learning how rooms work. She knew how to position herself. She knew how to move through a crowd and make it look like the crowd was moving around her. She was talking to a cluster of guests when Charlotte came within proximity of the group. This was normal, which at these events, the royals circulate, they overlap, they drift in and out of each other's orbits the way planets do, close enough to acknowledge, distant enough to maintain the illusion of independence. What happened next was captured by multiple cameras. It was seen by dozens of people standing close enough to notice. And it was over in less than 4 seconds. Camilla turned. The motion was fluid, casual, the kind of pivot a person makes when they're shifting their attention from one conversation to another. Her arms swung wide. It wasn't a dramatic gesture. It wasn't violent in the way that word usually means. But the force of it, combined with Charlotte's proximity, combined with the fact that Charlotte was standing near the edge of a stone garden terrace, a raised section of the lawn that dropped down a steep decorative step, sent the girl off balance. Charlotte stumbled, and not a small stumble. Not the kind you recover from with a quick step and a laugh. She was on the edge of the terrace. Her, to be fair, right foot found nothing but air. Her body tilted at the angle that precedes a fall, the angle that takes less than a second to become something much worse. The for what it's worth, Royal Protection Officer saw it before it finished happening. He was stationed 11 feet away, and his name hasn't been released publicly, but people who work in Royal Protection know exactly who he's. He had been watching Charlotte basically because that was his job that afternoon, his assigned principle, his responsibility. He had been tracking her movements the way trained protection officers track their principals, not staring, not obvious, but constant. A sustained peripheral awareness that looks like casual standing and is actually something else entirely. He moved before his conscious mind had fully processed the instruction to move. That, TBH, is what good training does. Plus, it removes the gap between seeing and responding. His body was already in motion before the thought had completed itself. 11 feet in under 2 seconds. He reached TBH, Charlotte as her weight was fully committed to the fall. His arm came around her from behind, catching her across the midsection, his other hand finding her shoulder, and he pulled her back onto the terrace in one controlled motion. Not rough. Not jarring, for what it's worth, which smooth, in the way that only works when someone has practiced it so many times that their muscles have their own memory. Charlotte's feet found solid ground. The whole thing lasted less than 4 seconds from the moment of the stumble to the moment she was stable. The nearby guests had seen it. Several of them had gasped. One woman near the roses put her hand to her mouth in the automatic way humans do when they witness something that nearly goes wrong. In my opinion, sound that nearly escaped the crowd, that collective intake of breath, died before it fully formed, swallowed back as people registered that the child was fine, upright, unhurt. Charlotte looked shaken. That is the honest word for it, not crying, not dramatically distressed, but the color had shifted in her face, and her eyes were bright in the way eyes get when adrenaline moves through a body that wasn't expecting it. She was young and she had just felt the specific terror of falling when you didn't choose to, the terror of the ground not being where your foot expected it to be. The protection officer, I think, kept one hand lightly on her shoulder for a moment longer than the catch required. Not holding her in place. Just present. The way you keep a hand on something recently unstable to confirm it's settled. She steadied, he stepped back to his position. The whole thing was over. Except it wasn't. Because moments like that don't end when they end. They continue inside the people who experienced them, and they continue inside the people who watched, and they radiate outward in ways that are invisible until they aren't. Camilla, in the seconds after the stumble, had turned back to her conversation. Whether she had seen what her arm had caused is something only she knows. Her expression, captured in several photographs taken in that window of time, is composed. Neutral, which the face of someone engaged in pleasant garden conversation. Whether that composure was genuine unawareness or trained performance is a question that became the center of considerable discussion in the days that followed. The photographers stationed at the permitted press area had their cameras pointed in different directions at the moment it happened. Most of them caught fragments, a turned shoulder, a blur of lavender, the protection officer mid-motion. Only 2 cameras, in my opinion, caught it clearly from a useful angle, and both of those images, showing Charlotte in the lean, showing the officer's reach, circulated online within 48 hours of the event. The palace didn't confirm or deny. This is standard. The palace almost never confirms or denies anything related to internal incidents, because to confirm is to invite inquiry and to deny is to invite accusations of cover-up. The palace's standard response to almost everything is either silence or a statement so carefully constructed it contains no actual information. What they said, when they eventually said anything, was that the princess was in excellent health and had enjoyed a wonderful afternoon. Which told you nothing and was designed to. But the people who were there knew what they had seen. A member of the catering staff who had been standing near the terrace edge told a friend that evening, and that friend told someone else, and by the time the story had traveled its natural path, the description had become remarkably consistent across retellings. The arm. Plus, the stumble. The edge. The officer. Plus, 4 seconds. Charlotte's own behavior in the remainder of the afternoon is worth noting, because it speaks to something about who she's. She didn't leave. She didn't retreat inside the palace or ask to be taken home or allow the incident to become visible in her manner. She circulated for another hour. She spoke to guests. She smiled. She stood beside her family and did the work that royal appearances require and showed nothing outwardly that you could point to. But people who watched her closely, people who study the micro-expressions and body language of public figures as part of their professional lives, noted something. She kept honestly distance from the terrace. She tracked, without appearing to track, the position of her protection officer in the crowd. Not obviously. Not to be fair, in a way that reads as fear on camera. But the distance she kept from that particular section of the garden didn't close again for the rest of the afternoon. The officer, for his part, moved when she moved. He recalibrated his position each time she shifted. This is standard protection protocol. But there was, several observers noted, an additional quality to his attention for the remainder of that event. The casual peripheral awareness had sharpened into something closer to direct focus. He wasn't performing his watch anymore. He was doing it with the specific, heightened care of someone who has been reminded in vivid terms exactly what is at stake. The garden party ended at its scheduled time. The guests actually filed out through the ornate gates. The staff began the long process of dismantling everything that had been assembled over 3 days. The flowers that had been chosen for their perfection began the process of wilting, because cut flowers always do. Charlotte left with her protection detail, and the car carrying her moved through the palace gates with the smooth efficiency of all royal departures, and, from the outside there wasn't anything to see. A family leaving a garden party. An afternoon concluded, which the ordinary appearance of things resuming their ordinary surfaces. Inside that car, what Charlotte was feeling isn't something anyone can report with certainty. She, I think, didn't give interviews about it. She didn't release statements. She was a child who had nearly fallen from a terrace at a formal event in front of cameras and dignitaries and her family. The person whose arm had sent her there had continued talking as though nothing had happened, and the person who had caught her had done so in 4 seconds without being asked. What a child, in my opinion, does with all of that, in the silence of a car moving through London streets, is their own business. The internet, of course, had opinions. Plus, once the photographs circulated, the commentary was immediate and it was loud and it was divided along predictable lines, those who saw it as evidence of something deliberate, those who saw it as an accident that had been distorted by bad timing and bad angles, and a third group who were primarily interested in the protection officer, who had done something elegant and unremarkable in the line of duty, and, suddenly, found himself at the center of enormous public attention. Basically, he had moved. He had caught her. He had stepped back. I guess, that was the job. But, people were watching that footage on loop and saying things about it. Because human beings, when they see someone do something right in a crisis, need to talk about it. Nobody was asking the right question yet. That would come later. The right question wasn't whether the arm swing was deliberate. The right question wasn't whether the palace would address it. The right sort of question was what Charlotte had understood in those 4 seconds between the stumble and the catch. What a young girl learns about the world when the ground disappears beneath her and a stranger's arm finds her before she falls. That answer was already forming inside her, quiet and private, the way important things form, not loudly, not all at once, but steadily, the way water finds its level. And, in a residence elsewhere in London that evening, a royal protection officer who would never speak publicly about his job sat with whatever protection officers sit with after days like that, the particular exhaustion of a professional who was required to be perfect and who will never receive the acknowledgement that the job requires him to never expect, who will show up the next day and do it again. The garden party was over. What it had, in my opinion, set in motion wasn't. The story that everyone thought was about a stumble was actually about something older and more complicated. It was about the architecture of royal family life, the invisible hierarchies, the performed harmonies, the distances that exist, between people who are required to stand close together. It was about what gets protected and what gets exposed and who decides which is which. It was about, a child on a terrace. It was about an arm that moved too wide. It was about a man 11 feet away who had been trained for exactly this moment and didn't hesitate. And it, I think, was about what happens in the spaces between those 3 things, the space between the arm and the stumble, the space between the stumble and the catch, the space between the catch and the silence that followed. Those spaces were where the real story lived. The palace walls kept it inside, the way palace walls always do. But stone keeps secrets imperfectly. It absorbs heat and releases it slowly. It holds the shape of things that press against it and shows, if you look at the right angle and the right light, the faint outline of what it's been pressed against. Something had pressed against it that afternoon. Something was being held. The second part of the story had not started yet. But it was honestly already in motion, the way consequences always are, quietly, at first, and then, all at once, the photographs spread the way things spread now, not gradually, not in a way that allowed anyone time to prepare, but, all at once, the way a wave doesn't announce itself before it arrives. By the morning following the garden party, 2 images had been shared across social media platforms so many times that the number of views had stopped being a meaningful unit of measurement. People weren't sharing them to report something. They were sharing them because seeing them made something move in the chest, and, when something moves in the chest, the modern instinct is to show it to someone else immediately. The pretty much first photograph showed Charlotte at the moment her weight was committed to the wrong direction. Her right foot was extended into the air beyond the terrace edge, her body angled at that specific and horrible lean that parents recognize immediately because every parent has watched their child reach that angle and felt their own heart drop ahead of the child's body. Her face in the image was turned slightly away from the camera. You could not see her expression. You could pretty much see everything else, which the second photograph, taken fractions of a second later, showed the protection officer already there. Already reaching. His left arm visible across her midsection, his right hand at her shoulder, his body angled as a counterweight to her momentum. The physics of it were clear in the image. He had arrived before she had finished falling. Together, look, those two photographs told a story in sequential panels, the way the best photographs do, the way images can carry a narrative weight that a paragraph of description can't match. You looked at image 1 and your stomach did something. You looked at image 2 and your shoulders came down from where they had risen. Between those two photographs was the whole event. Everything that mattered had happened in the gap. What the photographs didn't show, what no photograph could capture because it exists in a dimension photographs don't reach, was the third element. In the background of the second image, slightly out of focus, positioned at the correct angle to have witnessed what her arm had initiated, Camilla stood with her champagne glass held at a particular height and her head turned in a direction that wasn't toward Charlotte. People noticed. The comment sections beneath the photographs weren't pleasant reading. They were the raw, unmoderated output of thousands of people seeing something that troubled them and having no clean place to put the feeling. Some people wrote with measured concern. Many people didn't write with measured concern. The theories that formed in those comment sections ranged from the entirely rational, this was an accident, garden parties are crowded, arm swing, people lose their footing, to the elaborate narratives that the internet constructs when it decides it's identified a villain. The Palace communications team was aware of all of it by 6 in the morning. Palace communications teams don't sleep when something is circulating. They monitor. They assess. Plus, they make calls to each other and to their principals and they use words like optics and narrative management and controlled response in low voices that carry the particular tension of professionals who understand that silence is a strategy but that silence has a shelf life and that the shelf life of this particular silence was shortening by the hour. The decision that was made, and decisions were made, in those early morning calls, even if the decision that gets made is the decision to daunting, was to say nothing for 24 hours. Honestly, this is standard practice. You don't respond to social media commentary at 6 in the morning with a statement. You wait. You see how the story breathes. You see whether it finds oxygen or whether it exhausts itself. This particular story was finding oxygen, which by midday, the photographs had been picked up by international media outlets. Not all of them, and not the serious ones, not immediately. But the ones that operate at the intersection of royal coverage and celebrity journalism had the images at the tops of their pages by noon, with headlines that were careful in their wording and pointed in their implication. Nobody, was making accusations in print. But the questions being asked in the headlines were questions that, by their nature, carried the accusation inside them. Was Charlotte pushed, asked one outlet, and the question mark was doing a great deal of work in that sentence, shielding the accusation in a grammatical construction that technically meant nothing while clearly meaning something. Royal Guard's heroic catch was the framing other outlets chose, which told a different story with the same images, not a story about what might have been done wrong, but a story about what had been done right. The same event, the same photographs, and two completely different stories depending on which element you chose to put at the center. This is how facts work in the media environment. Not falsified, not invented. Just aimed. The same true thing, aimed in different directions. What nobody was writing about, in those first 24 hours, was the texture of life inside royal spaces, the specific way that the dynamics between Camilla and the whale's children operate in practice, in private, in the unrecorded moments that exist between public appearances. Because nobody outside those spaces can access that information directly. What gets written about those dynamics is always secondhand, always filtered through sources who have their own interests, always shaped by the agendas of whoever is speaking and whoever is listening. But people who had spent years in proximity to the royal family's inner workings, the former staff, the long-serving household employees, the people who had watched these relationships across many years and many rooms, were being contacted by journalists now. Not on the record. Nothing that would go on the record. But the informal conversations that inform formal reporting, the background conversations that shape the questions journalists ask even when the answers don't appear in print. What those conversations described was consistent enough to be notable. The, in my opinion, relationship between Camilla and the children of the Prince and Princess of Wales had never been simple. This actually isn't a secret, which it wasn't a secret that required exposing. It was written into the family's history, into the circumstances of how it had been formed, into the complicated architecture of loyalty and grief and remarriage and the particular cruelty of children being required to deal with adult failures that aren't their failures. Charlotte and her brothers had grown up inside that architecture. They had been required from very early to manage the social performance of a family structure that contained within it the fault lines of an earlier catastrophe. The garden party had not created a problem. It, I guess, had made a pre-existing condition visible. What was new wasn't the tension. What was new, was that a camera had been pointed at the right place at the right moment, and the gap between the public performance and the private reality had briefly, publicly narrowed. Charlotte, for those 48 hours of media coverage and commentary, wasn't present in any way that could be observed. In my opinion, she wasn't photographed. Plus, she wasn't seen at public engagements. This was consistent with her schedule, which didn't have additional commitments in that window, and it was therefore impossible to say whether her absence from the public eye was natural or deliberate. The palace wasn't going to clarify. Her protection officer was also not identified by name, which is standard. Protection officers aren't public figures by design, which their effectiveness depends in part on their anonymity. But the social media coverage had generated a kind of populist recognition, people sharing the image of his reach, his catch, his immediate movement, with captions that ranged from the appreciative to the reverent to the slightly unhinged, because fame is a strange thing and it finds strange objects when it needs an outlet. What the coverage wasn't saying, because it didn't know, was what had happened in the hours after the garden party within the palace walls. What had been said between principals? What had been said between the protection team and their supervisors? What Charlotte's parents had said when they were alone with her, and what she had said back? Whether Camilla had acknowledged anything to anyone in private that her public expression had not shown. Whether anyone had told her anything about what the footage and photographs were going to show the world, and what her response to that information had been. Those conversations happen inside sealed rooms and they'll stay inside sealed rooms, because that's the compact that royal life requires. The performance of family harmony isn't optional. It is structural. It holds the institution together the way load-bearing walls hold a building, not visible, not decorative, but remove them and everything comes down. The pressure that was building outside the walls was doing something that pressure always does to sealed spaces. It was testing them, looking for the weak points. Looking for the door that opens under enough weight. 2 days after the garden party, a statement was released. It was brief. It was the kind of statement that requires a specific skill set to produce a statement that appears to say something. While saying nothing, that acknowledges the existence of a conversation without confirming any of its content, that closes down inquiry by appearing to welcome it. It expressed that the occasion had been a wonderful celebration. It made no reference to any incident. It thanked the guests. It was signed, in the oblique fashion of palace communications, from a spokesperson, which is the institutional equivalent of a voice coming from no particular direction. The actually void of that statement was more informative than any direct comment could have been. People read the absence. They always do. A statement that describes a wonderful celebration in response to photographs of a child nearly falling from a terrace is a statement that has decided not to explain itself, and that decision to not explain is itself explanatory. The media covered the statement with the same divided framing that had covered the original photographs. Half the coverage treated it as closure, an official response had been issued, the palace had spoken, the matter was settled. The coverage treated it as confirmation. The palace would not comment directly on the incident because direct comment would require acknowledging what had been in the photographs. Charlotte's next public appearance was scheduled for the following week. A charity visit, pre-planned, the kind of engagement the Wales family fulfills regularly and that forms part of their public function. The question being asked by everyone watching was simple: how would she look? Not what she would say, nobody was going to ask her anything directly. But how she would carry herself, what her face would show, whether the brief rupture of the previous week would leave any visible mark in her expression or her posture or her proximity to family members. This is what the public looks for in royal bodies. The story that the face can't help telling even when the mouth has been instructed to tell nothing. The protection officer who had caught her would be there. He would be there the same way he was always there, visible enough to be functional, invisible enough to be professional. 11 feet away or some equivalent distance, recalibrated for the new space, watching her the way he was paid to watch her, with the additional layer of attention that a man carries when he's been reminded in clear and specific terms what the stakes of inattention are. The week between the garden party and the next public appearance was a week that nobody on the outside could see into. But, inside it, things were settling into new arrangements, the way things always do after a disturbance. Furniture pushed by a tremor finds a slightly different position on the floor. Water disturbed in a glass resettles at a new surface level. People who have pretty much been through something, even something that lasted 4 seconds, even something that resolved without injury, carry the event forward into the next room and the room after that, and it becomes part of the architecture of how they move. Charlotte was moving through that week. The palace walls held what they held. And, out in the world, the photographs were still there, not trending anymore, past the initial burst of attention, but persistent in the way that true things are persistent. The kind of image that people save to their phones without knowing exactly why, that gets sent in private messages between people who are paying attention, that sits in the permanent record of a particular afternoon when the light was pale blue and good and the flowers were fresh and something happened in 4 seconds that changed the shape of what everyone thought they knew. The story wasn't finished with becoming what it was going to become. The most important development had not happened yet. It was waiting, the way important things wait, not with patience, which implies a choice, but with inevitability, which does not. Charlotte's next public appearance came on a Tuesday, which is an unremarkable day for most things. The chosen day for royal engagements when the week's optics need to be managed carefully, far enough from the previous weekend to allow the news cycle to breathe, close enough to feel responsive rather than evasive. She arrived at the Children's Hospital in Kensington with her mother, which was itself a kind of messaging. The two of them together, which the image of that pairing, a mother and her daughter, steady and warm and present, doing the quiet work that palace communications can't do with words because words, in this case, would make everything worse. People noticed. People always notice what is placed in front of them, and they notice twice as hard when they're already looking. Charlotte walked into the hospital with the same straight posture she always carried in public, the same practiced ease, the same genuine quality of engagement that had always been the thing people remarked on when they met her. She sat with sick children. Plus, she spoke to them without the performative softness that adults sometimes affect around illness, the false lightness that children see through immediately because children are better at detecting performance than adults give them credit for. She was real with them. This isn't a small thing. It is, in fact, the thing that distinguishes the royals who are beloved from the ones who are merely respected. The cameras recorded it all at a respectful distance. Nothing in her face showed what the previous week had put there. This is either a remarkable capacity for compartmentalization or a remarkable capacity for presence, and the distinction matters enormously and can't be determined from photographs. Both things are possible simultaneously. A person can be genuinely present in a hospital room with a sick child and also be carrying, somewhere below the surface, the unresolved weight of a garden terrace. A 4-second fall and all the questions that fell can't help but generate when the people closest to you haven't explained themselves. The protection officer was there. He was where he always was, close enough to be functional, distant enough to be invisible. If you knew to look for him, you could find him at the edge of most of the hospital photographs. Standing in doorways, which positioned at a slight angle to the group that allowed him the maximum field of view. not watching Charlotte with the heightened attention that the previous week had sharpened, or if he was, it didn't show. His face carried the professional flatness of trained restraint. But he was there, and his being there was itself a kind of statement. The steadiness of a continued presence. The quiet reliability of a person who showed up and did the work without requiring anything from the work in return. Charlotte, in one of the photographs from the hospital visit, can be seen glancing briefly in his direction between rooms. It is a fraction of a second thing. The kind of thing that most people scrolling through an image gallery would not register as meaningful. She was looking at something. She was then looking at a sick child and smiling with full attention. The sequence lasted less than 2 seconds and was captured purely by the chance alignment of a camera pointed at the right angle at the right moment. But people who had been watching closely, people who had spent the intervening week analyzing the garden party photographs down to pixel level, saw the glance. They said things about it in comment sections and on forums and in the long chain of message threads that develop around public figures who have become objects of sustained interest. They said that it was a check, which that she was confirming the position of the person she had learned, in 4 specific and visceral seconds, she could rely on. Whether that interpretation is accurate isn't something anyone on the outside can verify. But the instinct behind it isn't irrational. Children learn quickly who shows up when things go wrong. They don't always learn this consciously. They don't catalog it in the rational parts of their mind and then make logical decisions based on the catalog. They learn it the way the body learns anything important, below the level of language. In the place where reflexes live, where the reliable things are stored separately from the unreliable ones. Charlotte had learned something in that garden in 4 seconds. She was doing what people do with that kind of knowledge. She was carrying it with her. In the wider conversation about the incident, a shift had begun to occur that nobody had explicitly planned. The initial wave of commentary, the divided, heated, accusatory first wave, had spent itself in the way online intensity always does. It can't sustain itself at that volume indefinitely. The energy burns and, then, it changes temperature. What replaces it? Something different. Cooler. Honestly, more considered. The kind of conversation that happens when the immediate outrage has cleared and what remains is the actual question. The actual question, the one that persisted after the hot commentary had cooled, was about systems. Not about individual malice or individual heroism. Both of those framings were too simple and too satisfying to be fully true. The question was about how institutions protect the people inside them. How royal life, with its specific architecture of performance and privacy and layered expectation, actually functions for the children who grow up inside it. What they're given access to. What is withheld from them? What decisions get made on their behalf by adults who are navigating their own interests alongside those of the children? This isn't a new question. It is perhaps the oldest question about royal families, whether the institution serves the people inside it or whether the people inside it serve the institution, and whether that distinction matters when the person in question is a child who didn't choose to be there. Charlotte chose nothing about the circumstances of her life. She was born into a specific family with a specific history in a specific country with a specific cultural relationship to royalty, and every room she enters has been shaped by all of that before she arrives in it. The garden party was shaped by it. The position she was standing in was shaped by it. The person who stood close enough to her that their arm, swinging in a casual pivot, sent her toward the edge of a terrace, that proximity was shaped by it. The protection officer was shaped by it too. His training, his assignment, his position 11 feet away from her on that specific afternoon, all of it the result of, I guess, systems designed to protect people who live inside other systems that aren't always designed with their protection as the primary consideration. What he had done was elemental. He, had moved, he had caught her. He had stepped back, which this is what the job requires, and he had done the job. But what made it matter, what made the photographs travel the way they traveled, wasn't the technical execution of a professional task. It basically was something more basic. It was that in a moment when everything that was supposed to support Charlotte had failed to do so, the setting, the event management, the proximity to a terrace edge, the casual arc of a nearby arm. One person had been paying enough attention to compensate for all of it in 4 seconds. People responded to "I think" that because they recognized something in it. The specific relief of being caught by someone who was paying attention. The specific gratitude, which does not always look like gratitude, which sometimes looks like anger, which sometimes looks like the deliberate composure of a face that has decided not to show you what is happening behind it, of discovering that someone was watching close enough to matter. The weeks that followed saw the conversation about the incident fold itself into larger conversations that were already happening. Conversations about the actually Wales children and how they navigate their position. Conversations about Camilla's relationship with the family she had married into and all the layered histories that relationship contains. Conversations about royal protection and whether the current systems adequately serve their principles, particularly the younger ones. These are conversations that produce no resolution. This is their nature. They are ongoing, living things that shift as circumstances shift, as new events provide new information, as the public's relationship with the institution evolves in ways that nobody controls. The garden party incident became one data point inside all of those larger ongoing arguments. A specific, visible, 4-second event that briefly made concrete things that are usually abstract. Charlotte's subsequent public appearances, across the weeks that followed, showed nothing that could be identified as a lasting mark. She was present. She was warm, she was the person she had always been in public, poised, genuine in the specific way she was always genuine, doing the work her position requires with what appears to be a real rather than manufactured investment in it. But people who study these things, people who pay close attention to the microchanges in how a public figure sort of moves through space over time, noted something that they acknowledged was possibly nothing and possibly significant. The physical distance she maintained, in shared public spaces, from Camilla had increased slightly. Not dramatically. Not in a way that reads as obvious or as a statement. The increase was in the range of a few feet, maintained consistently, the kind of margin that looks natural in photographs and would be impossible to call deliberate without a baseline comparison of many images taken across many months. This could be coincidence. Public figures move differently in different spaces, and reading behavioral meaning into the few feet between two people in a crowd requires a willingness to project narrative onto ambiguous data. Or it could be something, and the most honest thing to say is that the human body remembers being on the edge of a terrace. It remembers the specific feeling of weight committed to the wrong direction, of the ground being absent where it was expected, of the sudden arithmetic of a fall that hasn't finished happening yet. The body stores that information and it uses it. Not with conscious decision, not with the rational mind's involvement. The body creates the extra distance because the body has learned what the extra distance is for. Whether you know, that's what was happening is something only Charlotte knows, and Charlotte wasn't going to tell anyone. What she had told people, in the only language she was using, the language of public appearance, of continued presence. Of the composure that's both trained and genuine and sometimes indistinguishable between the two, was that she was still there. Basically, still doing the work. Still the person she had always been in the public rooms she had always inhabited. The protection officer was still there too. 11 feet or the equivalent. Watching the way he always watched. Doing the basically job the way the job requires, without acknowledgement, without credit, without the expectation of either. The to be fair, institutional anonymity that makes the work possible also makes its weight invisible to everyone except the person doing it. There's something important in that. The person who catches you when you're falling does not need you to remember it publicly. The catch isn't an act that requires payment or recognition or the specific currency of gratitude that gets expressed out loud. It is an act complete in itself. The falling was stopped, which the person stood up. The afternoon continued. Everything after that, the photographs, the commentary, the palace statements, the weeks of public conversation, the slow drift of a few feet in a crowd, all of that was aftermath. The story that grew from a 4-second event and became something larger and more complicated, the way stories always do when they touch something true about the way people live inside institutions and inside families and inside the gap between what is performed and what is real. What was real for what it's worth was a garden and a terrace and an arm. That swung too wide, and a child who found the edge, and a man who was 11 feet away and didn't stay there. Everything else is the story we tell about that. Actually, the telling isn't finished. Plus, it will not be finished for a long time, possibly ever, because Charlotte is young and her life is long and the institution she lives inside is ancient and complicated and does not change quickly and isn't designed to. The things she carries from a Tuesday afternoon in a palace garden will become part of the architecture of who she becomes, one piece among many, one moment among many, one 4-second window inside a life that will contain thousands of them. But it will be in there, which the body knows what the body knows. And, somewhere in the institutional records of the Royal Protection Service, in the files that don't get released and the briefings that don't get published and the debriefs that happen in rooms without cameras, this event exists as what? It's a moment when the gap between the position and the person that position was intended to protect was crossed in less than 2 seconds by a person whose job required him to cross it and who didn't hesitate. That is the whole story, and it's also the smallest part of it. The gardens are still there. The terrace is still there, its stone edge unchanged, its drop unchanged, the decorative step that marks the place where the lavender dress tilted at the wrong angle still exactly where it was. Gardens don't remember the events that happen inside them. That is the look, burden carried by the people who were there. That is the weight that a 4-second moment places on a child who will spend years becoming the adult she's going to become, carrying it, not carrying it, setting it down, picking it back up, doing with it whatever she eventually decides to do, in the private interior of a life that belongs entirely to her even when it appears to belong to everyone. Whatever she does with it, she will do it upright. She was caught before she fell. That matters. It is the one thing in this entire story that's clean and uncomplicated and true without qualification. She was caught. Plus, she's standing. The afternoon she had wasn't the afternoon that almost happened. The rest is everything that comes after a moment that changed its own ending at the last second and then went on, the way mornings do, into the rest of the day.